When I started my first year of college, I was excited about the possibilities. I was moving into the dorms, stepping into a world of independence, and I figured sharing a room with a stranger could be part of the adventure. I've always been good with people, making friends easily, so I assumed my randomly assigned roommate and I would hit it off or, at the very least, coexist peacefully. I secretly hoped we might share some common interests and could bond over late-night conversations. Unfortunately, I couldn't have been more wrong. Move-in day came, and while my side of the room quickly filled with boxes, clothes, and posters, my roommate's side remained eerily empty except for a few scattered belongings. His name was Mike, and though his things were there, a couple of shirts hung haphazardly in the closet, an old duffel bag slumped in the corner. Mike himself was nowhere to be found. My parents helped me set up my space, but even after they left, the room remained quiet. It wasn't until the next day that I finally met him. I just returned from my first class and was hoping to relax before the next one. As I walked into the room, there he was, Mike, sitting at his desk with his back to me, scribbling something in a notebook. He was of average height, had short blonde hair and glasses, and carried himself in a way that screamed, "Don't bother me." When I said hello, he barely glanced up, muttered a quick, "Hey," and returned to whatever he was doing. I tried to be friendly, introducing myself and offering a handshake. He hesitated before shaking my hand, his grip weak and disinterested. I learned that he was a sophomore, originally from a small town several hours away. That was the extent of our conversation before he turned back to his desk and made it clear he wasn't interested in chatting. Over the next few days, things only got weirder. Mike was rarely in the room, and when he was, he kept his distance. If I tried to make conversation, he would respond with curt, one-word answers. Then, one evening, he snapped. I'd made some offhand comment about the weather, trying to fill the silence, when he turned to me with an icy glare and said, "Stop talking to me. I don't want to be bothered." His tone was so cold that it caught me off guard. I decided right then and there that it wasn't worth the effort to get to know him. Mike's behavior became more erratic as the weeks went by. He would disappear for days at a time without explanation and return as if nothing had happened. I'd wake up in the morning and he'd be gone. No note, no hint of when he'd be back. One night, around 11 p.m., I heard shouting in the hallway. I peeked out to see Mike arguing with another guy on our floor. His voice was raised, filled with anger, and he stormed back into the room moments later. The next day, one of my floormates pulled me aside and warned me to keep my distance. "That guy's not right," he said. He flipped out on me just for saying hi. I started feeling uneasy around Mike. There was something about him. His unpredictable behavior, the way he seemed to harbor a simmering anger, that put me on edge. I decided I'd request a new roommate as soon as the semester ended. For now, I tried to avoid him and kept to myself. Thankfully, he was gone most of the time, leaving me to enjoy the room alone. But the uncertainty of when he might return gnawed at me. One morning, I woke up, got ready for class, and left for the day. When I returned that afternoon, I stepped into the room and froze. My side of the room was completely empty. Everything, my clothes, books, bedding, and even my snacks, was gone. Only the bare furniture remained. Mike's side, however, looked untouched. It was as if my entire presence in the room had been erased. I was certain I had locked the door before leaving that morning, so how could this have happened? I immediately suspected Mike. After all, who else could have done this? I began searching his side of the room but found nothing out of the ordinary. He had so few belongings, just a couple of notebooks, some clothes, and a blanket, that there was nowhere for him to have hidden my things. Feeling panicked, I went to the resident assistant and explained what had happened. They helped me check the building, but there was no trace of my belongings. Campus security got involved, but without cameras in the old dorm building, there wasn't much to go on. For the next 2 nights, I crashed in a friend's room, too uneasy to stay in my own. Then, campus security called with news. They had found my stuff. It was scattered across a wooded area just off campus. My books and clothes were damp and covered in leaves, and some items were missing or ruined. As for Mike, he was gone. He never returned to the dorm, and no one saw him on campus again. The school reassigned me to a new dorm room, this time a single, and even gave me a gift card to replace some of the lost items. It was a small consolation for such a bizarre and unsettling experience. To this day, I have no idea why Mike acted the way he did, or why he took my things and dumped them in the woods. Was it a prank? A cry for attention? Or something darker? I'll never know. All I do know is that I was relieved to be done with that living arrangement and have been much more cautious about roommates ever since. This experience still lingers in the back of my mind, raising questions I may never have answers to. What do you think could have driven someone to act like Mike did? Do you believe his behavior hinted at something deeper, or was it simply a case of a difficult personality? When I was younger and trying to make ends meet, I ended up sharing a small, two-bedroom rental house just outside the city with a guy I barely knew. His name was James. I hadn't met him before moving in, but the rent was cheap and splitting it seemed like the most practical solution at the time. The house itself wasn't much to write home about, a modest, somewhat run-down place with creaky floors and thin walls. It wasn't ideal, but it was what I could afford. James seemed normal enough at first, though admittedly, we didn't interact much. He was quiet and kept to himself, which I didn't mind. I figured we'd coexist as distant roommates and leave it at that. For the first week or two, things went smoothly. We both kept to our rooms, or were out working most of the time. Our few interactions were brief and polite, usually happening in passing in the kitchen or living room. I thought this arrangement might actually work out. Then, something strange happened one night that completely shattered the fragile sense of normalcy. I was jolted awake by loud, insistent banging on my bedroom door. The sound was so sudden and aggressive that my heart immediately started racing. Disoriented and half asleep, I called out, asking who was there, but the knocking stopped abruptly and no one answered. My first thought was that it had to be James. After all, who else could it be? But when I opened the door, the hallway was empty and his bedroom door was shut tight. I stood there for a moment, my mind struggling to make sense of what just happened. Maybe it was a prank, though James hadn't struck me as the prankster type. Feeling unnerved but too tired to dwell on it, I went back to bed. The next morning, James was already gone by the time I got up. I'd planned to ask him about the incident, but without the chance to bring it up, it slipped my mind as the day went on. That night, though, the same thing happened. Once again, I was ripped from sleep by that loud banging on my door. This time, I was irritated. I shouted, asking what was going on, but just like the night before, the knocking stopped as soon as I spoke. I jumped out of bed and flung the door open, only to find the hallway empty again. My eyes darted to James's bedroom door, which I noticed was slowly closing as if someone had just entered. Frustrated, I knocked on his door, demanding an explanation. "James, what's your deal? Are you trying to mess with me?" I called out. There was no response. The silence was eerie. I considered barging in but decided against it. Annoyed and uneasy, I went back to my room and tried to fall asleep, though the idea of someone deliberately messing with me made it difficult to relax. Maybe James was sleepwalking, I thought, but that didn't seem to fit. Sleepwalkers didn't typically pound on doors. By the third night, I was at my wit's end. The same relentless banging woke me up again, but this time I didn't hesitate. I shot out of bed, stormed to the door, and yanked it open. There, standing right in front of me, was James. He didn't say a word, just stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. It wasn't anger or annoyance. It was something colder, more unsettling. "What is your problem?" I demanded, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and nerves. Instead of responding, James shoved me back with surprising force and bolted to his room, slamming the door behind him. Furious, I followed him, pounding on his door and shouting for him to come out. But he didn't say anything. He didn't open the door. After several minutes of getting no response, I gave up and went back to my room, seething. That was it for me. I was done. I decided right then and there that I needed to find a new place to live as soon as possible. The next morning, James was still home when I woke up, and I finally confronted him. I asked him point blank why he'd been banging on my door at night. To my surprise, he didn't even try to deny it. Instead, he looked at me with that same unnerving expression and said, "I don't like you. I don't want you here." His bluntness caught me off guard. Up until that moment, I'd assumed he was just strange or socially awkward. But this felt deliberate, almost malicious. I told him I was already planning to move out and that he wouldn't have to deal with me much longer. He didn't say anything else, just turned and walked away. Within a few days, I found a small apartment across town and packed up my things. The sense of relief I felt when I left that house was overwhelming. My new place wasn't perfect, but it felt like a haven compared to the strange tension of living with James. The last few nights I spent there, he didn't bother me again, though I barely slept, half expecting another incident. Looking back, I still don't know what James's deal was. Maybe he wanted to scare me into leaving, or maybe he just had some deep-seated issues he didn't know how to handle. Whatever the case, his behavior was far from normal, and I'm just glad I got out when I did. The whole experience taught me an important lesson about vetting potential roommates more carefully. Sometimes, even if someone seems fine on the surface, you never really know what's going on in their head. What do you think motivated James's behavior? Was he trying to intimidate me, or was there something deeper going on? Have you ever had a strange roommate experience like this? I'd love to hear your thoughts. When I first started living with Leah, I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. She wasn't my best friend or even someone I'd known for very long, just a former classmate from college with whom I shared a few laughs and the occasional coffee. But she seemed fine, normal even, and splitting rent with her felt like a smart financial decision at the time. The house was modest but decent, located in a quiet neighborhood, and for most of our lease, everything was relatively uneventful. We were polite to each other, kept our distance, and had a good rhythm going. But looking back, I realize how easily people can hide who they truly are. The trouble started during the last month of our lease. Both Leah and I had plans to move out. I'd managed to save enough money to find a slightly nicer apartment closer to work, and she said she was planning to move in with her boyfriend. At the time, I didn't question anything she told me. Why would I? She wasn't the most sociable person, but she seemed harmless. It wasn't until everything fell apart that I realized how naive I'd been. It was a Thursday night, and I was winding down after a long day. I'd been up late in my room scrolling through job listings on my laptop when I started hearing noises. Soft shuffling sounds and faint whispers that didn't match the usual creaks and groans of the house. At first, I thought Leah was moving around in the living room, but something about it felt off. Just as I was about to open my door to check, I heard Leah scream. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp and panicked enough to send a jolt of fear through me. Before I could process what was happening, my bedroom door burst open, and 3 men in black masks stormed in. They didn't say a word, just motioned for me to stand in the corner. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I obeyed, not daring to move or speak. One of them began tearing through my things, yanking open drawers and dumping their contents onto the floor. Another grabbed my laptop, phone, wallet, and anything else that looked valuable. The third man stood by the door, watching me with unsettling stillness. It was terrifying how methodical they were, like they'd done this before. The entire ordeal lasted only a few minutes, but it felt like hours. When they left, I was paralyzed with fear, listening to their footsteps retreat down the hall. As soon as I was sure they were gone, I ran to check on Leah. Her door was wide open, and she was sitting on the floor, her face pale and tear-streaked. She told me they'd taken her phone and wallet, too. Her voice was shaky, and she kept saying how scared she was. In my panic, I didn't question anything she said. All I could think about was how to contact the police without a phone. We ended up knocking on a neighbor's door and using their phone to call 911. The police arrived within half an hour, took our statements, and assured us they'd do everything they could to catch the intruders. They asked if we'd noticed how the men got in, and I told them I was certain I'd locked the door. Leah said the same thing, but her tone wavered ever so slightly. At the time, I chalked it up to nerves. The next few days were a whirlwind of stress and frustration. Replacing my stolen items was a logistical nightmare, especially since they'd taken my ID, credit cards, and phone. Leah seemed equally frazzled, though oddly disinterested in following up with the police. Every time I asked if she'd heard anything, she brushed it off, saying, "What's the point? They're long gone by now." That should have been my first clue. 2 weeks later, with just a few days left on the lease, I stopped by the house to grab the last of my things. Leah wasn't expecting me, and when I pulled into the street, I noticed an unfamiliar car parked in the driveway. Something about it didn't sit right with me, so I decided to hang back and watch. After a few minutes, 3 men got out of the car. They were carrying backpacks, and as they approached the house, Leah opened the door and let them in. My stomach dropped. They weren't just any men. I couldn't see their faces clearly from my spot across the street, but their build and movements reminded me of the intruders from that night. I stayed in my car, watching as they emerged a few minutes later, without the backpacks. Once they drove off, I decided to confront Leah. I walked up to the house, adrenaline pumping through my veins, and found her standing in the living room, looking startled. "Who were those guys?" I demanded. "Just some old friends," she replied, her voice unnaturally high-pitched. I wasn't buying it. "Cut the crap, Leah. Did you let them in that night? Did you set this up?" The accusation hung in the air like a bomb about to go off. Her face hardened, and she snapped, "You have no idea what you're talking about. Get out." I left, but I went straight to the police. The more I thought about it, the more everything added up. Her lack of concern, the way the men seemed to know exactly where to look, and now this. It didn't take long for the police to connect the dots. The men had been trying to sell my stolen laptop at a nearby pawn shop, and when they were caught, they implicated Leah. She confessed to everything. She'd orchestrated the robbery, pretending to be a victim while her accomplices took only my belongings. The betrayal hit me like a freight train. I couldn't wrap my head around how someone I'd lived with for months could do something so cruel. She'd smiled in my face, shared meals with me, and all the while, she was plotting to steal from me. The police recovered some of my things, but the emotional toll was far worse than the material loss. Trusting someone like that felt like a mistake I'd never make again. Now, every time I think about roommates, I can't help but wonder, how well do we really know the people we share our lives with? How many hidden agendas go unnoticed until it's too late? Would you have seen the red flags in my situation? Or would you have trusted Leah too? A few years ago, I shared an apartment with 2 women, Emily and Jessica. The place wasn't anything fancy, just a modest 2-story building with a front door that opened straight to the parking lot behind the complex. It wasn't ideal, but splitting the rent 3 ways made it affordable. We found each other online, and at first, it seemed like we'd lucked out. Emily was great, kind, easygoing, and a considerate roommate. Jessica, however, was a completely different story, and living with her turned into a nightmare I'll never forget. At first, things seemed fine. Jessica was polite during the initial weeks, but as time passed, her true colors began to show. She never helped around the apartment, left her belongings scattered everywhere, and used our dishes and food without asking. Even worse, she never cleaned up after herself. Plates piled up in the sink, trash overflowed in the bins, and she didn't care. Jessica's boyfriend was over constantly, and they'd blast the TV late into the night, making it nearly impossible to sleep. To top it off, they smoked in her room, filling the entire apartment with an awful, stale smell that Emily and I couldn't escape. After a couple of months, I hit my breaking point. I approached Jessica and politely asked her to start contributing more, to clean up after herself, help take out the trash, and at least be respectful of our shared space. She gave me a lazy shrug and said, "I pay my rent, so I don't have to do anything else." Her dismissive attitude infuriated me, and from that moment, I gave up trying to reason with her. Emily tried to talk to her as well, but Jessica's reaction was the same. Occasionally, Jessica and her boyfriend would disappear for a few days. Those were the most peaceful times. Emily and I cherished the quiet, knowing it wouldn't last long. One day, though, things escalated. Emily was at work, and I came home to find Jessica had stuffed more trash into an already overflowing bin. Annoyed, I grabbed the bag and took it to the dumpster out back. When I returned, I discovered the front door was locked. I hadn't taken my keys because I thought I'd only be gone for a minute. I knocked on the door, expecting Jessica to let me in, but there was no response. I pounded harder, calling out her name. Still nothing. Luckily, I had my phone with me, so I started calling her. She ignored me, letting it ring over and over. After 10 tries, she finally picked up, only to curse me out and hang up. Furious, I kept knocking, yelling through the door to let me back in. When it became clear she wasn't going to open it, I had no choice but to call the police. When the officers arrived, Jessica reluctantly opened the door, acting like she didn't know what was going on. "Oh, I didn't hear you knocking," she said, smirking. It was an obvious lie, but the police explained she couldn't legally lock me out since my name was on the lease. They left after making sure I was back inside, but the tension between Jessica and me was unbearable after that. Shortly after, she announced she'd be staying with her boyfriend for the rest of the lease. Emily and I were thrilled. She moved out most of her stuff but left her keys behind, which should have been a red flag. For the next 2 months, Emily and I enjoyed the peace. Then, Jessica stopped paying her share of the rent. We covered it to avoid problems with the landlord, figuring it was worth it just to keep her away. But as the end of the lease approached, something happened that completely blindsided us. One night, while Emily was in her room and I was up late, I heard glass shattering in the living room. My stomach dropped. Someone was breaking in. My first thought was to call the police, but before I could, I heard footsteps coming toward my room. The door burst open, and there stood Jessica. "What the hell are you doing?" I demanded, my heart pounding. She looked annoyed, as if I was inconveniencing her. "Why didn't you answer the door?" she snapped. "I didn't even know you were knocking. And why did you break the window?" Jessica shrugged nonchalantly. "I lost my key." I couldn't believe her audacity. She proceeded to announce that she was moving back in because she'd broken up with her boyfriend. When I reminded her she hadn't been paying her rent, she rolled her eyes and said, "What are you going to do? Evict me? I don't even live here anymore." The whole situation felt surreal. I was relieved the lease was almost up because I couldn't imagine dealing with her for much longer. Thankfully, Jessica's stunt with the broken window led to her being officially evicted. The landlord didn't tolerate the damage, and the police warned her to stay off the property. After that, she vanished from our lives. Looking back, Jessica remains the most bizarre and frustrating roommate I've ever had. The experience taught me an invaluable lesson. Be extremely careful about who you choose to live with. The wrong person can turn your home into a living nightmare. Have you ever dealt with a terrible roommate or an absurd living situation? If so, how did you handle it? I'd love to hear your stories. When I started college, my first 2 years were spent in the dorms. In my freshman year, I got assigned a random roommate named Jack. Jack was a bit offbeat. He had an odd sense of humor and said some pretty weird things, but we got along well enough. We weren't really friends, but we'd chat every so often since we shared the same room. About a month into the semester, rumors started spreading about a strange guy roaming campus at night. According to the stories, this guy always wore all black and kept his face covered with a ski mask. He wasn't just lurking around. People said he'd actually chase students and cause trouble by tipping over trash cans, writing on walls, and even sneaking into dorm rooms to steal things. No one knew who he was because he never revealed his face. Naturally, the campus was buzzing with speculation and unease. At first, it seemed like an urban legend, something to laugh about while swapping stories in the common room. But then, someone in my dorm reported that their room had been broken into. They left their door unlocked, and when they returned, their room was trashed and their laptop was missing. The thief? That mysterious masked man everyone was talking about. Hearing about it made me nervous. I started triple-checking the lock on my door and trying to avoid being out alone at night. Up to that point, I'd never actually seen the masked man, but the idea that he was around and targeting students felt too close for comfort. I figured if I just stayed vigilant, I'd never run into him. That all changed one random afternoon when I got back to the dorm early. Class ended sooner than expected, and when I walked into my room, everything seemed normal. I figured Jack was still out since he usually stayed on campus until late. I settled in, started scrolling through my phone, and tried to relax. Maybe half an hour later, the door unlocked and swung open without warning. Standing in the doorway was the masked man I'd been hearing about. For a moment, I froze, staring at the figure that everyone had been so spooked by. Then he reached up, pulled off the ski mask, and it was Jack, my roommate, my quiet, somewhat quirky, but ultimately harmless-seeming roommate. Jack stared at me, and for the first time, he looked genuinely caught off guard. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice tense. It was clear he hadn't expected me back this early. I asked him what he was doing in the mask and why he'd been causing all that trouble around campus. Jack didn't have a good explanation. He just told me that if I told anyone, I'd regret it. The way he said it sent a chill down my spine. In that moment, I knew I had to tread carefully. I didn't want to provoke him, so I told him I wouldn't say anything if he just returned the stolen laptop to the guy in our dorm. Jack agreed, and for a brief moment, I thought that would be the end of it. The next few days were quiet. Jack stayed out of the room for the most part, and I didn't hear any new stories about the masked man. But when I asked the kid whose laptop had been stolen if he'd gotten it back, he said he hadn't. That was the final straw for me. I couldn't live with Jack anymore, not after what I discovered. I went to the housing office and requested a room change. Fortunately, they approved it quickly, and I was able to move into a new room the following week. When I told Jack I was leaving, he wasn't happy. He warned me again not to tell anyone. I just told him to return the laptop and left it at that. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't let him get away with what he'd done. He hadn't just scared people. He'd stolen from them, wrecked their spaces, and created a tense, unsafe atmosphere on campus. I finally decided to report him. After I filed the report, things got tense. Late one night, around midnight, I heard someone trying to open my door. I cautiously approached and peeked through the peephole. It was Jack. He stood there, jiggling the doorknob, knocking, and eventually pounding on the door so hard I thought it might break. When he started kicking it, I was genuinely scared. I knew I couldn't let him in, but I also wasn't sure what he might do. Luckily, my resident assistant heard the noise and came down the hall to investigate. When Jack realized someone else was there, he ran off. I reported the incident the next day, and that was the last straw for the school. They expelled him for his behavior and for the thefts he'd committed. It felt like a weight lifted off my shoulders knowing he was gone. The guy whose laptop had been stolen finally got it back, and campus life started to feel normal again. Still, I spent the rest of that semester with my guard up, always half expecting Jack to show up again. I haven't seen him since, and I'm glad it ended before things got worse. Now that I look back, I'm still not sure what motivated Jack to do all those things. Was it boredom? A need for attention? Something darker? I'll never know, and maybe it's better that way. It left me with plenty to think about, and a new appreciation for choosing roommates more carefully.